This is Ken, and we're at IP Possibilities 2012. We just heard a keynote from David Lewis of ANPI. David, please tell us a little bit about ANPI, and then I'm going to have a few questions for you.
Sure. ANPI is a carrier, ANPI zone, ANZ is a carrier's carrier. We provide services primarily to the independent telephone community, so we serve roughly 700 independent telephone companies across the U.S. who in turn serve roughly 7 million access lines throughout the country. We also serve Tier 1 carriers, CLECs, and wireless providers.
And you made a very interesting comment about the voice network devolving. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that, and we'll have a conversation.
Sure. Over the course of probably the last 2 years, we've seen an escalation in the relative predictability of terminations. What I mean by that is that historically, we've seen a fairly high level of consistency and predictability of our ability to terminate calls throughout the United States. And there was no marked difference between terminate to an urban area, an RBOC-driven area, and those served by ILECs. Over the past 2 years, we've actually seen a gap begin to be created, and it's rapidly widened over the course of the last 2 years. NECA recently did a study noting that up to 24 to 30% of the calls were being affected by inconsistent call quality or calls simply not making it to rural geographies. Again, we're in a fairly unique position because we serve so many LECs and we interface with a number of carriers that we employ to terminate calls in these areas, and the problem has just dramatically expanded over the last 2 years. And despite the FCC's recent declaratory ruling attempting to stem the issue, we've actually seen that based on the survey we conducted with our ILEC customers, that the majority of those folks have actually seen no change or the issue actually devolving since that declaratory ruling. So when I say there's a devolving issue relative to the predictability of the PSTN, we're seeing an increasing number of calls either being compromised as far as the quality is concerned, the experience, i.e. no caller ID, or calls simply not making it to these exchanges. And it's having profound public safety, commercial implications on these companies and the customers they serve.
Yeah, as you were pointing out, sometimes these are hospitals trying to get a hold of doctors and so forth that are outside their local area. They're not too far away, but in a long distance area.
Absolutely. We've seen in certain situations where enhanced 911 isn't available, that actually calls to PSAPs are being affected, or these 911 call centers are actually being affected where calls are not making it to the 911 PSAP location. That's probably the most extreme case of a public safety issue associated with the incidents of the problem I'm talking about. But as you mentioned, hospitals, doctors not being able to have predictable communications with their patients, people calling an elderly or infirmed relative not being able to get through. So this has some very, very significant far-reaching implications. Commercially, it's devastating. I was speaking with a company that serves a sawmill in the Pacific Northwest, and they noted that their orders were down 40 to 50% because people are not being able to contact them. They serve the entire country and beyond the U.S., and they're simply not getting calls. Up to 30 to 35% of their calls are not going through to these rural exchanges.
And it really boils down to, we'll maybe talk a little bit about some of the specifics of standards and stuff like that, but let's get to the root cause. It's an economic issue, right?
It's an absolutely economic issue. I mean, the bottom line is voice continues to be commoditized, quite frankly. And margins that are available through provision of voice services continue to be compressed. There's a huge economic incentive for companies to regrow or stem that trend, quite frankly. So when you look at where can costs be cut, access continues to be the predominant or largest element of the costs that companies incur to terminate services. So to the extent that companies can bypass that cost element, they can regrow or realize a margin increase immediately. Now, in order to do that, to avoid access, carriers are engaging in a range of alternative solutions. In fact, that desire to avoid access or regrow margins has really resulted in the creation of an ecosystem, or I call it the mosh pit, of carriers that are offering very low-cost terminations or rate decks with very aggressive rates. The problem associated with it is that often they employ substandard technology. In essence, oftentimes a proxy server using open source software in the cloud with an open IP front end and back end. There's no standards of interoperability that are available, and even if there were standards, the whole issue is would these companies comply? It's a very guerrilla-oriented approach to the market.
It's not like back in my day, I suppose, back 15 years ago or so, where you had a Belcore standards process, and things had to go through standards and go through testing and so forth. It sounds like we're kind of in a Wild West scenario now, where a lot of that standards testing has gone away.
Right, it is. I mean, there are certainly advantages, both from a product breadth and economic perspective, legitimate economic perspective, that are supported or enabled by a network of networks. So it's not the issue of necessarily more players participating and all bringing their value to the network. It's an issue where there's an economic driver, and that there are strategies that are being crafted to specifically address that desire, and those strategies have a natural impact. Folks are bypassing access. They're employing oftentimes substandard technology. LCR is making it very difficult.
Low-cost routing.
Least cost routing is, and those issues may be introduced 4 or 5 iterations from the point that the call enters the network. So it's very difficult to isolate. There are a number of players that are engaged in this, and quite frankly, the economic incentives are so tremendous that unless a counterweight is introduced that address the economic incentives, we're going to continue to see this issue rage, especially in rural America, where the costs and the access rates are simply much higher. So the incentive to bypass those are much greater.
Well, and you've, in your talk just now, you spoke of some things that are going on. Why don't you kind of give a recap on that as far as, to address the situation?
Sure. Again, I think NTCA, OPASCO, WIN, NECA have continued to hammer this issue home, and we've attempted to support those efforts. But ultimately that led to the FCC's webcast, which then was an early effort into which resulted in the FCC's declaratory ruling. Now, actually, again, we've seen not much impact in the marketplace associated with the initiation of that, but there are subsequent efforts by, for example, NECA. They're conducting a test calling plan this week to see if the issue continues to rage, if it's gotten worse. I mentioned a previous study that they conducted where 24% of the calls to rural America suffered from this issue. They're actually engaged in a more extensive, more scientific approach to understanding the incidence of the issue and its impact. So that is going on this week. 100 volunteers are making 80 test calls apiece, so we'll have an 8,000 call sample of the issue. We're also seeing activity at ADIS, which is the standards body, attempting to articulate standards as far as how networks and next generation networks can exchange traffic. My suspicion about that effort is I think it's a reasonable and logical exercise, but the bottom line is ultimately it will produce voluntary-based standards. And if folks aren't complying with laws that have truly potentially significant civil penalties associated with their transgression, then I'm a little bit suspicious of what a voluntary standard is going to accomplish. But nevertheless, that's a complementary effort, and then we're engaged in a number of self-help activities as well.
I don't know if you wanted to talk about what you're doing there.
Sure. We have provided feature group D only solutions. We have one carrier that we have had a very strong experience with that we've had predictable results. So in essence, kind of a more centered, quality-focused solution. It costs more money, but it has predictable results. We're also expanding our tandem service, because oftentimes the issue is associated with companies interconnecting at the point of the tandem, not having accurate billing detail where companies can bill access. Those create holes that are then exploited by people who identify those holes and make those available to the broader community. So by having a tandem in which those holes are addressed and those gaps are filled, that in essence stems the realization of those issues. So those are the primary areas that we're engaged in, and obviously we're continuing our support of the associations as far as regulatory efforts are concerned. I think the other issue that really is out there is if you refer to the Access database, and there are a number of them out there, but for example we use TEOCO. And if you go to a ComTel show and get a rate deck, oftentimes the rates inherent in those rate decks are well below the access costs as reflected in a TEOCO database. Well, if folks are marketing services below the actual cost of terminating them, when terminating them means complying with the rules and standards, it gives rise to obviously some concern. So certainly one thing the FCC could do is to bring some type of mandate as far as the relationship between rates available in the marketplace and those associated with underlying costs. They took a similar step in terms of rate comparability in the 96 Act when they required a comparable rate be established between urban and rural areas. Something very analogous to that could be adopted, whereby there has to be some comparability between rates offered to the marketplace and their comparability or recognition of underlying costs.
And that could just be a rulemaking that no legislation is required or anything.
Certainly, that's correct.
Well, David, I appreciate your time, and thank you for the summary.
Thank you, Ken.